Many texts that we have analyzed this semester cover the motif of identity through the various themes and protagonists. Through their conflicts, introspection, or spiritual acknowledgement, the protagonists come to find their identities and their sense of self. I will be discussing the presence of a search for identity throughout 10 of these texts that we have read this semester in AP Literature and Composition. In The Stranger, the protagonist Marceau is highly apathetic, creating an inherent sense of amorality in him which detaches him from society. His identity is defined by the rules he believes to be true of the world, yet it ignores any rules inherent to human nature because they are simply not present in his mind, and he chooses to live only in terms of surviving. Toward the end of the novel, however, Marceau's imprisonment and impending execution forces him to face the truth that he is morally detached from humanity, as he has finally become physically estranged instead of just figuratively. Whereas Marceau's identity was before categorized among the amoral and indifferent, he finally begins to understand the passions that plague and drive all of humanity, and he's finally able to be introspective and understand who he is and where he fits into society. Converse to Marceau and the Stranger, Humbert Humbert is a man entirely motivated by his passions and poor intentions, regardless of their morality. The novel follows Humbert Humbert and his adolescent lover on their road trip, forcing the readers to read about their immoral and grotesque relationship. Though Humbert's actions are entirely horrific, he still spends the story attempting to justify his actions and identity to the readers. He begins his journey for justification as a means of convincing others that it isn't as bad as it seems. However, by the end, he seems to be searching for solely self-validation in order to clear his own conscience. He no longer cares about saving his head in court, but instead wishes only to validate himself. Dante finds himself through the gates of hell with the spirit Virgil as his guide. As Virgil leads Dante through the 9 circles of hell, Virgil forces him to witness the punishments that others are put through for their sins. Dante witnesses the sins that isolate men from salvation, pushing him to understand the identities that humanity, and thusly God, beg us to conform to. Dante uses his poem Inferno to discuss the various identities of humanity and the identity he believes we should find through our spirituality and reverence by refraining from committing sins such as these. In Catcher in the Rye, the protagonist Holden Caulfield tries to find his way home after failing out of school once again. However, he doesn't seem to belong anywhere he finds himself, as he is unable to get along with others, and his self-exclusion leads him to become more depressed and essentially lost. Though he tries to be cool about this estrangement, he realizes how detached he is from humanity, and yet can't seem to make himself feel accepted or belonging in a society. He loses touch with his identity and is unable to find his way back. Prince Hamlet becomes distraught when he discovers that his father was killed by his uncle, King Claudius, who has now married Hamlet's mother and taken over the throne. He begins to detach himself from society as he falsifies insanity in order to cover his revenge plan. Soon, however, his identity begins to lie more inside of this insanity that he was previously faking, rather than outside of it. Hamlet's identity becomes defined entirely by his intentions to kill Claudius and the insanity he has adopted, and he loses touch with his self. White lines, super rich kids with nothing but loose ends. His famous lines, "to be or not to be," refer to his indecision about whether or not he should commit suicide, as he no longer understands who he has become and whether or not he is worthy of living any longer. Nora Helmer's growth as her own person is halted by the oppression of her father and her husband, who believe she needs to conform to the traditional gender rules of the society in which they live. However, she begins to realize that she is only what her husband has made of her, instead of being the person divined by her own aspirations. At the end of the play, Nora chooses to leave her husband and find her own identity. She realizes that, in order to grow, she needs to put herself first and decide for herself that she should be a priority in her own life, and that she has the ability to own her own identity, separate from those with whom she surrounds herself. When the main characters find themselves in hell, they realize that they are definitively alone with others. Stuck in a room with strangers, they begin to open up to each other and discover the truth of humanity that lies in how we create ourselves. They also begin to wonder what parts of themselves are real and what parts of them existed only to please others while they were alive, and they lose touch of their human identities quite quickly. Symbolically, they are also unable to look into mirrors in hell, thus having to look to others in order to find their own identities. Sartre's play reminds us of how much of our identities we find in others. A Clean, Well-Lighted Place is a short story depicting a deaf old man wishing to stay longer in the cafe in which he has found solitude. The older man is accompanied in the cafe by 2 waiters, a younger waiter who wishes to go home, and an older waiter who wishes to not be lonely. Though companionship can be seen between the three men, the loneliness that pervades all of them in their own ways is what places the distance between their separate identities. Hemingway uses these characters to discuss the identities of those who need others for comfort when they find themselves alone. In the Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa refuses to believe the circumstances he is faced with when he wakes up as a cockroach one day. On a literal level, Gregor is refusing the identity he has developed and wishes instead to continue his human life. However, as the story progresses, Gregor begins to accept this new identity of his and starts to adapt to the life of a cockroach. Kafka is also using the motif of identity on a symbolic level to discuss the altered identities of those who have suffered from some sort of mental abuse. He uses Gregor to represent the ways in which mental abuse victims are changed, such as becoming quieter or more guilt-conscious. Paradise Lost tells the story of Satan's temptation of Adam and Eve. The temptation from God's former angel leads to the persecution of Adam and Eve, forcing them to be sent away from paradise or the Garden of Eden. The original sin leads to the sinning of all humanity, estranging God's creations from that which they were meant to be. Milton discusses the parts of our being that are altered by this first sin and the identities we have created from the shame that was pressed upon us.
One night to speed up truth, we had